Hi everybody, I'm Zilla Blitz and welcome to our overview video of Stalingrad Roads, published by Nuts Publishing and designed by Nicolas Rident. This operational tabletop wargame covers the Soviet breakout from Stalingrad in November of 1942, all the way up through Manstein's counterattack in March of the following year. It's a lot to look at, let's jump in and get started. Here's a bird's eye view of all the components as we do a quick overview before we dig in and look at them in detail. One thing to be aware of, this is the third game in the Roads series. There are two previous games to this, Victory Roads and Liberty Roads. And so if you are fans of those games, the thematic play style, I think, has been carried over to this, although they do mention that there's been, of course, a lot of changes made to kind of fit the game system for this particular theater and this particular operation. So big picture, this is a two-player game. Gameplay length is listed as 1 to 5 hours. There are 5 scenarios, so the 1 hour experience is going to be that 2-hour introductory scenario. We'll take a look at that as we look at more detail on the player aids. And then there's a 5-hour, the longer length is the campaign game, which is that 5th and biggest scenario that covers all 5 historical months that are available for this game and 17 turns. Turn length is roughly 1 week. Unit scale is divisions and corps, although there are some German divisions that are split, armored divisions that are split up over 2 or 3 counters. One of the hallmarks of the Roads series has been its enjoyable gameplay, and I think the mechanics highlight this. So let's take a brief run through on some of the key mechanics. As would be expected in the Soviet versus German World War II battle, weather plays a role, and as would be expected in any battle of Stalingrad, supply plays a huge role. Matter of fact, for the German player, managing the supply situation around the Stalingrad pocket is a key element to do well in order to succeed at the game. There is also Operation Mars, this was Operation Uranus for the Soviets. Operation Mars, which was a concurrent operation running at the same time as this one, can also impact what happens here. So depending on how that operation goes, there's an entire mechanic for the crossover influence between those two operations. Very interesting support system, which is kind of a counter draw system that gives players options for some creative gameplay. And we'll take a look at that as we look at some of the player aids and the counters. I think this is one of the most interesting aspects of the game as I look through the components here that I'm really curious to play. Offensive planning as the Soviet part, so when to execute your major offensive and how to do that and how to execute that's a big part of gameplay. Related to that is Soviet momentum. There's a mechanic for the Soviet offensives petering out, and so managing that momentum as the Soviet player is big. It's also worth mentioning that this is an I go, you go. So the Soviets are going to take their turn, then the Germans are going to take their turn, and turns alternate back and forth in a very kind of a traditional war game style. Exploitation, breakouts for armored units as modeled. Stavka is the Soviet kind of high command, and as the Soviet player, there is a mechanic for requesting and getting a variable amount of reserve forces allocated to your operations from Stavka. So that can vary from game to game as well. And lastly, on the flip side of that is the Manstein marker. So there is kind of a prestige element between that relationship between Manstein and the Führer that's modeled here. Manstein even can get, if it goes badly enough, he can get dismissed, but that relationship for resources for the Germans, for the battle, for the frontier, and how that relationship goes is an interesting mechanic as well. So I think as I look through these mechanics and I've kind of gone through the rules, it seems to me like there's going to be, even with the same scenario, things can play out very differently depending upon, for example, how Operation Mars goes, how the Manstein-Führer relationship goes, Soviet reserves. There's going to be some variety in here that's going to, I think, make each scenario a different experience no matter how many times you play it. Let's take a look at the rulebook. Altogether, it is 28 pages, but the last 2 pages here are kind of an index, and then we have a kind of some combat resolution tables that are also in the player aids too. Then we have the previous pages here in front of that. Up through from page 23 are the scenarios. So the rules in and of themselves are about 22 pages. Really nice layout. I think Nuts Publishing is really doing a fantastic job with the layout and design of their games. I mean, just really clean and crisp here. I love the look of this rulebook. I've read through a good chunk of the rules. Things seem pretty clear, pretty straightforward. I really like how we've got a lot of examples. This whole top of this page is an example. Again, here is a combat examples here. So doing a really good job of kind of highlighting the rules with good examples, and the organization of the rules really crisp and clear. Again, another example here for combat. So I really like the effort and integrity brought into the rule system here. I was going to give this a complexity rating. I would say a 4 out of 10. Again, until you play, it's really hard to kind of evaluate a rule system in and of itself, but very promising rule set here. And again, I really like the design and the cleanness of the rules. Before we leave the rules, let's do a brief walkthrough of the scenarios. This introductory scenario actually is the only one that's not in the rulebook. It's got its own little player aids and map off to the side. We'll see that as we look at the player aids, but this is the 2-turn, 1-hour shorter scenario. Then Operation Uranus here is scenario 2, so the kind of the Soviet offensive. This is a 3-turn scenario, so kind of the initial part of the campaign. This is the full campaign here, scenario 3, so 17 turns. This would be your 5-hour experience, and there are player aid setup mats for each of these too. We'll take a look at those as we look at the player aids. The backhand blow is Manstein's counteroffensive, which is the back end of it, and then Star and Gallop kind of takes place. It's more of a middle scenario, 7 turns from February turn 1 to March turn 3, so kind of getting to the latter part of March there. So there we have the rules and the scenarios. Nice clean rulebook. Things look good. Counters, 560 half-inch counters printed on both sides. Backside is the step loss side. For most of the units in the game have 2 steps to them. Kind of a traditional counter system here. If we look, for example, at one of these German armored units, we can see the left-hand number represents the attack strength, middle number is defense, and the right number is your movement. And then there is a star based if the unit is an elite unit. But nice, crisp design. I love how they have actually taken the numbers, and put them in a darker color on the white boxes there to make the contrast really clear and nice and legible, even though, I mean, these are half-inch counters, but the numbers stand out really well, I think, on these. We can also see here, we've got this band on some of these German units. So these are both 2 units that represent the 7th Panzer Division. Some of the German armored units are broken up like that. The right-hand side, we've got Russian units, we've got some German minor nations involved. So as we look at the second sheet now, we can see some more Soviet units, German Kampfgriff units, some out of supply markers here. Then down in the middle here, and I believe it's here, we have the support systems. So these are chits that you're pulling out that you're going to then play to kind of influence some of the actions that you have on a turn. Soviet surrender, so Axis surrender, order number 277. And each of these, as we'll look on this player aid, we'll take a look at, kind of gives an explanation for how these work. But this kind of creates, I think, knowing how to use these well could kind of have a significant impact on gameplay, and getting the right one in the right place at the right time could be a fun power move, if you would, to influence how the battle swings in your favor. Let's take a look at our player aids now. These are kind of a thin cardboard, if you would. There are a fair number of them, and they fall into 3 types. There are 2 player aids for the first scenario. Then we have some player aids for just in general for informational player aids, more traditional. And then we have the setup sheets for all of the different scenarios in the campaign game. So here we are seeing, this is the kind of the special rules and the victory conditions for the scenario Wintergewitter, which is the 2-turn introductory scenario. And this here is the map for that scenario. So you don't use the large map for the small scenario. It's a very small scenario designed to kind of get you up to speed with the system. Basically a learning scenario, if you would, the first of the 5 scenarios. So really nice that this is, you can see this kind of really concentrates the forces. It's a 2-turn scenario, and it should get you up to speed in how to play the game. The second type of player aids are the setup cards for the scenario. So this one we can see for the campaign game. And then there's this is also used for Operation Uranus. Down here we can see in the bottom left what supports are available for the Germans here, and 1 for each side. I really appreciate it when developers do these. They just make the setup so much easier, so much cleaner, and so much faster. And then these are usually double-sided. So here's the one for the Soviets for Star and Gallop, and there are a fair number of these kind of leading you through, ones for each scenario. Now we come into our more traditional player aids. These are identical. So one side is this terrain map, the terrain effects chart. The other side here is the combat resolution and weather table. So 1 for each player, kind of highlighting terrain effects, of course, combat resolution, and then the weather impact. So nice that there is one made available for each of the 2 players in the game. Mentioned earlier on the Operation Mars mechanic. This is the player aid that helps players track this. So a die roll happens, and that's going to influence what happens with the outcome of Operation Mars, how that's going, everything from a Soviet collapse to Soviet breakthrough. And depending upon what happens there, it has an influence on the Stalingrad region and the offensives in which you're doing in your game. So basically you're going to be rolling some dice and then seeing the consequences of those actions. So even though there are 5 scenarios, I think it's important to realize that scenarios are going to play out differently depending upon how Operation Mars goes in one game as opposed to another game. Each player also has their own set of player aids for their own support tracks and some of their own unique mechanics. So this is for tracking eliminated and withdrawn units for the German player. Then this is the player aid. Up here we've got the Führer approval track on the map. And then different elements here: supply level, air bridge going into Stalingrad, and events associated with the Ju-52 units, which is a little of a unique kind of a chrome element to the game. And this is the German support marker. So this basically gives you the actions to follow when you play this particular support on a turn. And they're all quite varied. We've got Hoth, Holit, Lascar, so Soviet surrender, Goring, artillery, Luftwaffe, Nebelwerfer, veteran, Axis reinforcements, Tiger, and each one of them has their own explanation, and there is quite a good variety of them here. And I'm pretty sure that not all of them are available in all scenarios, so you could get a different set depending upon the scenario, but I think it's a really fun way, again, that's going to add in a skill that the players are going to have to pick up, understanding how these work and how to play them well, but then giving some more variety to each one of the scenarios. And then we have an equivalent yet unique set of player aids for the Soviet player for keeping track of reserves here. And then this is for major offensive, minor offensive tracking, acquisition of Soviet supports. And then an equivalent support marker system for the Soviet side, yet of course unique to them. And we can see again there's a good collection of supports here. I'm going to guess probably maybe 15 to 20 different types of support markers that can be brought to bear in the game. So again, this looks like a really fun system and a way to create a lot of variety out of a modest set of scenarios. And lastly, our map. Very clean, crisp design. I think this is going to bring a lot of clarity to the game. I like the color palette they've used here, and I like the ease of identification that I've got as I'm looking at hexes. This is a game that's going to be, I think, visually easy to parse, and I think it's going to pop really well with the units and the counters on there. Going to get some nice contrast. So I like this map. This is a paper map, 23.5 inches on the vertical by 33 inches wide. And this, I flipped it now, so Stalingrad is over here on the east side, and then we run west with north at the top. Now, I couldn't find a hex scale. I might just have missed it, but I know it's about 240 miles from Stalingrad to Rostov here, and there's about 21 hexes, so roughly about 10 miles to a hex on width, with about 500 miles, I would guess, going 400, 500 miles across the whole map here from east to west. Now, the hexes sizes are 7/8 of an inch, and again, units are 1/2 inch. Also, if we talk about stacking in the game, to give an idea of how it's going to play visually, the rough stacking rule, there are a few kind of exceptions and a little bit of some variety there, but is 3 divisions to a hex. So I think you're going to see roughly piles of units that could be as high as 3 units, but I don't think it's going to be a monster stacking game as we look at it. But again, yeah, really clean design here. And then as we look at this, it's probably good to talk a little bit about victory conditions. By and large, you're playing for locations. You're trying to capture certain locations. I don't see too many scenarios where losses come into play. So it does seem like a lot of this is going to be geographically oriented. Can you take that ground and can you hold that ground in order to win your scenario? And then, of course, dependent upon each scenario, the victory hexes and what you're trying for is going to be different. Lastly, let's take a moment to talk about solitaire. I don't see anything in the rules. I mean, possible I could have missed stuff, but I don't see anything in the rules or in the gameplay that would really hinder solitaire, like cards. I mean, the support systems and the support markers, perhaps, because you may not know what your opponent had if you're playing with 2 players. But I think on the whole, it's going to be a very kind of conducive system for playing solitaire, with the caveat again that you're going to be playing both sides. You'll play the Russians and you switch and play the Germans, playing back and forth. There isn't a bot or a card deck to support solitaire play. But with all that in mind, a game like this would generally fall to me in like a 6.5 solitaire game, where it's a very smooth, looks like it's going to be a fun, playable game that you could explore 2-player, but also be pretty conducive to solitaire play. So there we have it, Stalingrad Roads in all its glory. I'm really impressed with the designs. People talk a lot about VUCA Sims games in terms of the elegance of their design, but as I'm looking at this, I'm reminded a lot of VUCA Sims and their design elements. I feel like there's an influence here and a quality here that really kind of brings these 2 game companies, at least from a design perspective, and together. And this is just, I think, a really nice clean, crisp design, and I've heard really good things about the Roads game system. I really like the kind of that support system. I like some of the historical influences that they've got going on in here in terms of crossovers from different offensives, in terms of the Führer approval, in terms of Stavka reserve. So even though, and a nice scenario set too. 5 scenarios looks like it's going to provide a lot of gameplay, especially when you consider the different ways these games could go based on some of those historical surroundings and the historical wrappers that go around it, and how people play those support markers too. So it looks like, I think this is I've heard really good things about the Road system. This looks like it's going to be just a joy to play. So if you've enjoyed this overview of this Nuts Publishing game, you might also enjoy an overview of Phantom Fury, another game by Nuts Publishing, covering a different scale, different theater, tactical solo game covering the attack on Fallujah in 2004. Thanks for watching, everybody. Have a great day.